Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the ABA Broadcast Engineering webinar. Our webinars are featured the third Tuesday of each month, and we try to have some good guests on to offer some information for both radio and television engineers. And we want to remind you that our program is actually underwritten by the good folks at RF Specialties South. I think RF Specialties is a nationwide organization, but then it's divided up among different areas of the country. So our area is the RF Specialties South. So as it says on the menu there, for all your broadcast equipment needs, give them a call. They furnish everything, I think, from the microphone, maybe even up to the tower beacon. And contact John George at that number there. There's his email address and his phone number. And speaking of John, I think John's with us today. Morning, John.
Good morning. You staying warm, Larry?
Uh, well, sort of. this in Alabama, we say if you don't like the weather, just wait a couple of hours and it will change.
Very true for all of us in the South.
Yes, you've had quite a bit over in your area too, haven't you?
Well, it's cold, but we had the false alarm this past weekend where they were calling for snow and then flurries and then nothing but rain occurred. And now the weather folks are whipping up into sleet and freezing rain for Saturday and Sunday. So we'll see what happens.
Yeah, it doesn't. I hate to be a meteorologist. There's just no way, to predict exactly what's going to happen. Uh,
Yeah, but you always get to keep your job if you're good, even if you're wrong all the time.
well, I guess you're right. My daughter lives in Pensacola, and they got snow, and we're here in Prattville. Didn't get nothing but rain, so go figure.
Yeah.
Well, our program today is one I think is very timely, and there's been a lot of issues about cybersecurity here lately. Well, it's been going on for many years, but it dies down and then it pokes its head up again. I sort of think that maybe the spammers come up with new type of ways of getting into stuff and getting around security. And so we thought we would take time today and talk about cybersecurity. And we've invited a good friend of ours, Wayne Pecena, from Texas A&M, who is manager of their IT department and also takes care of their broadcast facilities. Welcome to the program, Wayne.
Larry, thank you for inviting me to participate. Certainly my pleasure to be here.
Well, we've had Wayne on several times and actually had him in person at our facilities in Birmingham when we do our seminars, and it's always been interesting, and people's come away and flooded Wayne with questions because there's so much in it. So I guess at the outset, it's no rocket science about this, but Wayne, cybersecurity is with us, and it's going to be with us for a long time.
That it is. I think one of the challenges often with cybersecurity, and particularly in the implementation, is that you treat it like you do many of your regular day-to-day broadcast projects. In other words, you implement whatever infrastructure, and you say, "Okay, this project's done. I'm gonna move on to the next one." And unfortunately, cybersecurity is a little bit more needy, so to speak. It requires some routine, regular housekeeping, and as a result, it's kind of a constant thing that you have to keep on your mind because the threat landscape changes, and you have to sort of be sure that you're prepared for those changes that come over time.
Is it the people out in the heatherlands that just love to get into stuff? Is that changing?
Well, I think when you talk about where does these threats come from that might impact a broadcast station, and I think they can come from several sources. There is the quote classic hacker, which in my mind, those are they're looking to make a buck. So they're usually going to be targeting some type of extortion. Ransomware, of course, is the popular thing now, but they're just out to make a buck. So a little bit of, let's say, protection up front generally goes a long way because they're usually not going to linger too long if there's, any barrier at all. It's like, locking your front door. If someone's going to break into your house, maybe they're going to try to see if you locked your front door. And if you did, they say, okay, I'll go on to the next one. Or your car parked in the driveway. You've locked the doors and they move on to the next car. So you have those type, of potential threat actors. And there are the what are called the kiddie scripts that the challenge is just to break into systems that they should not have access to. They're not interested in necessarily doing damage or causing problems. The challenge is breaking into a system that they do not have normal access to. And of course, one of the problems with that, sometimes good intentions go wrong and they end up doing things. And then, of course, you can't rule out the insider or the competitor um, that are out to do some harm because they have a grudge against your station. Maybe that's your management, maybe that's the programming you have or the programming you used to have that's not there anymore. So there can be several threat actors. But again, I think that classic hacker, they're just out to make a buck, is probably the dominant one, particularly when you get into the ransomware world.
Right. Some of them, which has always amazed me, they're not really after making anything because it doesn't really allow them to make any money, but they just get into things just to see if they can get into them, I suppose.
Yes, that's like the person that has lockpicking as their hobby. They're not out to steal anything or do damage, but it's that challenge to get past that quote barrier um, that motivates them to.
And then they once they get in, if they see something they can do to cause havoc, they'll go wide open. I once had a call from a radio station that said something that happened to his EAS unit, his Sage unit. He said every morning during drive time, it starts running all kind of weird tests, for like from Oregon or California or something like that, and it was coded so that it was interrupting his program. So I told him, I said, well, right now just bypass it, go back behind it, and just pull the plugs out and
Plugs, yep.
bypass it till we can figure it out. And when I got down there, I couldn't even log into the unit myself. And I discovered in talking to the folks at Sage, and we found out later that they had not changed their password. They had their generic. Somebody had gotten into it, wiped out the configuration, redid it, and I suppose created a white list or a black list or something where nobody could get into it. So we actually had to do just a memory dump, dump everything out and reprogram it and put secure stuff in there. So that was somebody that was not going to make any money. They just thought it was cool that they could get in there and play with it and cause havoc.
Yep. Creating that disruption, I think, is the goal. The kind of the world of cybersecurity is, there's a lot that you can do. You can spend an awful lot of money on cybersecurity, but there's just some fundamental basic things that often get overlooked, and that becomes that opportunity for someone, whether they are a quote serious hacker, that casual um, someone looking to just simply disrupt your operations, uh, that often are just simply overlooked. We always hear about, you kind of constantly hear preaching change, change your password. Well, you really need to go a little bit further than just changing a password. You need to have strong passwords. And of course, we could spend probably our hour talking about what a strong password is, but that simple just having a password is really not adequate anymore, because the serious, again, particularly the hacker that is looking to break in, they're going to be using a password dictionary. Uh, and many times, uh, you're really not dealing with a person that's trying to get in. What you're dealing with is a automated script using one of the variety of quote hacker tools that are available, that's sitting probably in a data center somewhere, executing a script looking for an opportunity to get into a given host device. And they may not even know what that host device is initially till they kind of drill down in it, so to speak.
I saw something the other day about they were talking about passwords and how to create, as you say, a strong password, and said some of these devices or softwares that hackers use actually they have a dictionary embedded in it,
Yep.
and they can sort of figure out the way the word is and look it up in the dictionary and see what letters will create different words.
Yes, that is very true. They are, readily available. In fact, you can go do a little Googling and you can find basically libraries of passwords that have been breached in the past. You can find, again, list or a dictionary is referred of basically passwords that have been exploited. Of course, dictionary words, that's a no-no to use something like that. And when you talk about having that strong password, that kind of definition might vary. But in general, I think it's going to be considered something at least 12 characters. 16 is my employer considers 16 is the minimum password length. And then that password needs to be a mixture of letters, upper and lower cases, uh, special characters, that sort of thing, all randomized, which, of course, if you meet that kind of criteria, that's not something any reasonable, or I'll call it normal person, can ever remember that. So you got to have a cheat sheet, which then that has its vulnerabilities itself. Or you use, a password manager, which is pretty good to create that randomized password, but then you may be relying on, that password manager not to be uh, corrupted, or some reason you lose access to that and so forth. So, there's a lot of gotchas you got to be aware of. So I think, all in all, from a practical standpoint, maintaining your own kind of secret list. Granted, there's applications, websites that will create random passwords for you, um, that fit that strong criteria and stuff. But the main thing, you got to change that in devices and not reuse that same password across, let's say, every device in your station. Um,
I think that's a gotcha that catch people a lot of time. They'll use
times,
the same password for various devices, and they say, well, that's easier to remember. Well, yeah,
remember, that's
but it's
right.
also easier for the. I think they call those things out in that world spiders that just look for IP addresses that they can try to get into. And I guess, and I'm sure you're very familiar with it, the old movie War Games, where the guy was trying to, he loved to play games on the computer, and he had this. It was years ago, and his computer set up. It was sort of funny if you've never seen it. His memory and all was on like a one of those 7-inch floppy disk things, and it's sort of old. But he had a program which would sit there and just dial random phone numbers, and if it would answer, if you could, he would find one that was actually that had data on it. He would try to get into it, trying to find games.
Yep.
There was some company that was coming out with a new game, and he was so eager, he wanted to get into it. And those of you who saw the movie remember that he finally got into it, but it was a actually a military thing that
Yeah, it was the
did.
DoD
Yeah, that's right.
computers. Yeah.
But one of the things that I remember in that, and I don't, of course, you work in it a lot more than I do. Uh, uh, the He got into it by using a backdoor password that the
Yep.
developer of the system had put in that's sort of hidden. Is that something that's common in computer and software development?
Well, I think that all depends on the particular, the platform and or the application. But yes, a lot of times they are backdoors into uh, different applications, even different hardware boxes. I'm not going to say that's a good thing, but from a developer standpoint, that's also kind of a way to help support products in the field. So that's something, if you're going to do that, I think that has to be very well protected. Uh, but that does still exist in some products.
Apparently, there's a way to do that and it not actually show up in the system. Nobody knew it was there. I
Yep.
don't. Logistically, I don't know how that works. It's probably a secret anyway. But there was a way that backdoor password was hidden from the normal. You could scan the disk and not find it.
Yes, that's true. That I'm gonna say is probably not in mainstream products. That I don't know that I can say that's a normal accepted practice, but I wouldn't also say it doesn't exist out there.
You touched on briefly a while ago about changing the password. From a broadcast standpoint, and we're just talking about radio television here, what would you suggest stations do as far as a time to change that password regularly?
Well, first of all, I'll say I'm not a proponent of changing passwords unless you need to. Usually, when you need to is when there's been some type of breach in your organization, is a time to change it. Other, again, corporate environments may say every 6 months we're going to change passwords, maybe every year. Um, but I kind of subscribe to the theory I'd rather have a quote strong password, which means it's going to, meet those some of the criteria I've mentioned about, a minimum length, a random combination of characters, special characters, upper, lower case, numbers, that sort of thing. No dictionary words, no, you know, successive numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you say need a 16 character password, listing out 1 through 16 is not acceptable. Those type of practices like that, so that you don't have to routinely change your password.
And I recall years ago that some companies actually had it set up in their offices where it automatically expired.
Yes.
That you would set it up because I know people would come and say, "Oh, my computer's I can't get on anything." Well, didn't you get the email that your password was going to expire? Uh, yeah, but I didn't think about doing it, so I don't know that people do that anymore.
Yeah, I think again that kind of goes back at I'll call it the policy that you probably don't have that level of bureaucracy in that small mom and pop station. But if you think about a group broadcaster, often there is a corporate IT department that is setting that type of policies and for you. One thing I might touch on is, when we talk about IT security policy, there's kind of two environments I think that we operate in. Certainly, we all have our servers with various business application, our email systems, kind of that business level of hardware that often you find a pretty robust cybersecurity practices there. But then at the same time, we have often this other environment of our various broadcast devices that, yes, they're certainly computers, have an operating system, but they often do not have that robust of security systems built in them. Often just a simple uh, since we've been picking on barracks already, pick on them a little more. It's just a simple password and or a login name and a password is the security system that is there. So often, I think we have to kind of separate those, and many times we have to kind of take additional precautions with those broadcast boxes because they do have relatively simple security, mechanisms built into them.
And the way the broadcast industry, especially in radio, is operating now, where a lot of the work is being done off-site at announcers' homes and places that way where they're voice tracking, that exaggerates that issue as well.
That's right. So this is kind of where you again kind of have to take some additional. You cannot just rely on the fact my barracks encoder has a login name and a password, or my Sage EAS unit has a login. You kind of have to go further than that and have the right environment, the right network environment, which means, having firewalled from the public internet, having encryption used anytime I'm doing something offsite or across a public network, have that path encrypted rather than across the open internet. And that's a way to kind of compensate for some of the lacking features that might be in a broadcast specific device from a cyber security standpoint.
Wayne, if I may ask,
Yeah, go
a
ahead.
lot of the folks, especially in smaller markets, all their equipment and computers are all on one network. I mean, the traffic person can access the on-air boards if they're IP oriented. I'd like you to focus a little bit on that if you could, because that's a real problem for small markets, and a lot of people don't ever address it.
Yeah, certainly the having the right network architecture really is kind of a first step in a cybersecurity plan. And simply what you want is a segmented network. Now, how many segments might exist? That's going to be up to the environment. But certainly you want to separate some of the fundamental things like, the business network, the automation network, the transmission network, in a simplistic. Those are all separate networks. Now, they may be built across a common infrastructure being Ethernet, but you segment those with VLANs. So if a breach does occur, for instance, someone gets into the business network in some manner, they're not able to actually access that automation or that transmission network.
And if you wouldn't mind explaining to, I'm sure most folks that we have online probably understand, but what is a VLAN?
Well, a VLAN is simply, well, the acronym, it's an acronym for a virtual local area network. And from that, it is simply a isolated network that is often built across a common physical infrastructure. In other words, let's say in a simple environment, I have an Ethernet switch and whatever number of host devices in my network. That's that physical network. Ethernet cabling between everything, but I can take and quote segment that network through the Ethernet switch into separate networks, virtual networks, but they're treated as isolated networks.
Does that take a managed switch to do VLAN?
Well, in general, if you'd asked me that a few years ago, I would have real quickly said yes. What's sort of complicated that's still a valid answer. It does take a managed switch, but now there's this kind of new class of devices on the market. They often are referred to as web managed switches. They are kind of in between that unmanaged, the classic unmanaged switch and the managed switch. It's kind of this in between that gives you some level of ability to configure, particularly with VLAN specific. So at least it will be a managed switch or quote a web managed switch. In other words, you have access to that switch operating system to do custom configuration.
Yeah, not all the functionality of a true managed switch, but it
Right.
does have uh, some of the features like VLAN and all.
Right. And generally this what quote marketing term that is, I guess, been developed of a web managed switch, specifically that switch, that management ability is in the creation of VLANs.
I know somebody asked me one time about VLANs, and I was talking to them. They said, "Well, if you have maybe four VLANs on one switch with, like you say, business and sales and engineering and all," and they said, "Well, if it's all segmented and they don't communicate, how do you communicate between VLANs?" You might want to, just for those
Yep.
that are not familiar with it, as John said, if you're in VLAN 2, you can still communicate with somebody in VLAN 1.
That's true. That's true. If you need, okay, and just the creation of the VLANs, in your example, you have four VLANs, you've just created four separate networks, separate IP addressing, completely isolated uh, from each other, even if they are, again, running across a common, let's say, Ethernet infrastructure in the station. So where you need that interoperability between networks, you would have to do some layer three routing to do that. Often you'll run across the term a layer three switch, and that's a common use of a layer three switch is to enable some interoperability between, let's say, two VLANs, maybe between three of those four VLANs. But you do that in a controlled environment. In other words, let's say the a desktop computer that's in the programming department, allow that one to communicate with the, let's say, automation control computer.
Well, if you've got this level of isolation or interoperability, how does that affect somebody if they got into the business side? What keeps them from getting over into the programming side?
Well, normally, again, uh, because you have isolated networks, you have minimized the attack plane that can be accessed. Think about the quote flat network, as John described, where you have everything in the station is on the same quote network. Once you, let's say, breach one host device, you conceivably have access to everything on the network. So the network segmentation, with breaking that up, it creates these isolated areas. And if you think maybe from back of some of my presentations, you might have seen the castle example I've used, to where the architecture of a castle to represent a segmented network. You have the moat. If you breach the moat, there's a wall. If that wall's breached, there's another wall. So you have these different layers of protection or levels of protection.
So even though the different segments of the different VLANs can communicate with each other, somebody from the outside doesn't have that, slows them down in getting from VLAN 2 to VLAN 4.
Right, because I'm controlling that interoperability. I'm not just saying, okay, everybody on VLAN 1 can talk to VLAN 2. I'm doing specific host devices on VLAN 1 can talk to a specific host device on VLAN 2. And taking it one step further, I'm going to control what type of communications can occur. In other words, not wide open to any application. Maybe it is a specific application, or often you do that by protocol and or port number that is tied to a specific application.
So that eliminates or sort of eliminates the out someone from outside being able to transverse.
Or at least makes it a lot more difficult to do.
Well,
Nothing is impossible, but it's uh, it's how practical it is.
well, if we back up the chain, the big word firewalls. Talk about firewalls a little bit and the importance of using, making sure you have a secure firewall coming into your building.
Well, certainly, I think the firewall is that, and it is that fundamental cybersecurity device. And of course, by saying device, that may be a hardware box, that may be a software application, depending upon your environment. But that's that fundamental cybersecurity um, device that you have when the public internet is involved. If you have never have any public internet involved, well, you might question, do I need a firewall? But from a practical side, if you have a network in a modern station today, you're going to have outside connectivity because that just has become a part of the world that we live in. You need to access some content from another location. You want that remote access to deal with trouble calls, so to speak, so you can, let's say, handle that problem from home as opposed to driving to the station. And of course, now that driving to the station could be across town, but it could be across the state when you start looking at multiple or group broadcasters with, stations scattered out across some geographical area.
The complexity of a firewall varies greatly by how much you pay, I'm sure, and the stuff that you want it to do. Uh, one, quite often we see internet service providers touting that they have a firewall. Are those talk about that and how effective those things are that the ISP actually says they have on their system?
Well, when we talk about firewalls, used to be real simple in what they did. Today, firewall is a somewhat generic name, but the capabilities of that firewall has somewhat expanded to where most will do some type of threat protection, uh, and with that comes some regular housekeeping where you have a library that has to be updated with different threats. Maybe that's updated on a daily basis, a weekly, but it has some routine upkeep for it. That's where often the service provider firewalls can be beneficial because that's sort of handled for you in the background by that provider, particularly when you get into dealing with email and content filtering and that sort of thing.
You see that in advertisements quite a bit, for the ISPs that they have
Right.
firewall protection. And I was just curious to how effective that was, but it's not a catch-all. You still it's still good to have one if you have somebody that can manage it correctly there on site.
Yes, having that on-site firewall, and in fact, even in a large networks, it's not uncommon to have internal firewalls. Yes, you have that, I'll call it border firewall or gateway firewall, but it's not uncommon to have internal firewalls within the network, simply to manage. For instance, let's take I'll call it a small group broadcaster. I have, let's say, 6 stations in my broadcast group. Do I want to put all of those behind one firewall? Probably not. I'm going to probably have multiple firewalls for each of those stations to isolate those.
There's actually a software firewall I think that you can actually run on your device. Is that correct?
Well, when you talk about firewalls, there's really two types. There's the I'm going to call it the traditional firewall, is a hardware based device. Granted, it has software, running on it, but you also can implement a firewall uh, that's strictly software based, and you run that on your own device, where that might be all the way from a Raspberry Pi to, hear a lot of people talking about taking an old PC and use that as a firewall device. That's probably not the best approach, but uh, certainly a software firewall can be viable if you have the inclination, the time, and the interest to basically manage that. Most people don't, unless you kind of put your geek hat on. And as a result, you tend to go with that appliance. That's something, once again, you don't want to, I guess, necessarily spend your time managing and doing the housekeeping associated with most firewalls that also incorporate threat protection and that sort of thing in them.
Talk a little bit about virus software. Uh, I know there's tons of them out there, some good, some bad, but how important is it that you have that protection on your? Because you don't particularly have it on in broadcast equipment, but you do on your computer systems. And
Right.
talk about the importance of having that and making sure that it's updated on a timely manner.
Well, certainly, I think if we're talking in a whether it's a broadcast station or any local business, having that virus protection on individual, let's say desktop computers, is pretty important. Uh, what you are, I think, protecting about is someone receiving that email, that website, whatever, and you're clicking on some link. Well, when you click, what happens? Maybe you go to another website. Maybe you end up downloading some type of file or something. And that's where that local firewall becomes important. Most of those firewall programs are going to have automatically update because you're probably paying a subscription charge for those, and they're going to automatically update. Uh, Assuming you have that feature turned on. So I think that is all important to do. But if you think about your typical broadcast device, it's not a person sitting there clicking on a variety of different links. It's in an isolated environment, usually doing one specific thing. And let's again pick on barracks again. What is that barracks box doing? Well, it's only either encoding audio or it's decoding audio, right? And it's more or less in a fixed environment.
So it wouldn't necessarily. It's not clicking on anything as you say. It's just doing what it's supposed to do, and that's
Yeah,
it.
that's
Even though
right.
it has access to the outside world, and something can get into it, it wouldn't automatically download something.
That's right. As think about that desktop computer um, that has access to a wide variety of applications and different types of those applications having different capabilities, different file types, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Wayne, not to put you on the spot, but of course, we know that Windows, for example, their operating systems always include uh, virus protection
Yep.
and firewalling. How does that compare to branded uh, firewalls and software? I mean, you have any feeling one way or the other? Because a lot of people don't want to pay for whatever reason, the 75 or $50 a year service and Microsoft it's included.
Yep. Well, first of all, I'll say I am quite comfortable with relying on Windows Defender uh, far as the virus protection at the local desktop PC level, and even that local built-in firewall to Windows. If you really kind of look upstream from that to that kind of border firewall for your facility, it's a kind of that first level of defense that is, taking the kind of the heavy load as opposed to, quote, attaching that desktop PC directly to the commodity internet. I'm going to kind of do the heavy lifting with that border firewall, take care of kind of global type threats and issues, and leave that individual desktop to take care of the application type stuff and the link, because that firewall, your border or gateway firewall in general is not going to do any kind of content filtering, although they are, I'll call them sophisticated firewalls with different names, like next generation firewalls that have filtering detection built into them. But that's not your typical firewall you're going to find in most station environments. You get into the corporate world, yes, uh, where you have, let's say, a Cisco infrastructure or a Jupiter infrastructure, then you might have that level of firewalls.
Would the fact that the Windows Defenders and stuff like that actually runs in the background, and as my understanding is, you don't have to update it. It updates automatically in the device.
Yeah, assuming you've not monkeyed with the default settings, because its default setting, it's going to auto update. Um, Certainly, that's something that is configurable. You could go change that for some reason, but I'm assuming you're going to leave those type of defaults alone so that it will automatically update. And when it encounters something, it's going to give you a message that we've quarantined a certain, let's say, file, um, and let you decide what to do about it.
I know one of the major broadcast groups in the United States actually has issued a notice to the stations to use Windows Defenders.
Yep.
and not have to download some other, Norton or McAfee or whatever. Just use Windows Defender. So apparently Windows did a good job on that.
Well, I think so. That's certainly a debatable topic. Is comparing across the different products that are on the market. But I look at most of those products evolved before uh, Microsoft decided to incorporate that into the Windows operating system. And as I stated, I feel comfortable relying on Windows Defender as opposed to buying whatever aftermarket antivirus software.
Right. At one time, off-site or off-system backups was a really big thing. Is that still something that stations should look into to make sure that they're like their library and both commercials and music content or whatever, that it's backed up to a system that is not online?
Well, certainly, I think keeping backups is an important thing to do. You can always fall back on the kind of classic IT backup rule, which is called the 3-2-1 rule, where for critical data, you keep three copies of it, two of those copies on different media, and one offline. So a cloud or offline type backup is a pretty practical thing, I think, to do. Uh, but at the same time, you kind of have to keep in mind what does it take to restore that. Certainly, often there's going to be a cost associated with that. So, you have to factor uh, those into mind. And when we talk about backups, what kind of backups are you doing? That can be all the way from full backups to some type of incremental backup, which, if you think about incremental backups, they save storage space, that sort of thing. But if you have to restore sort of in the reverse order, which takes time. And does your operation allow that time to do that?
Yeah, I recall. I guess it was a year or so ago when the everybody remembers the Sinclair uh, problem where they got
Yep,
hacked into it, and there were a number of stations that were really, for all practical purposes, dead in the water. I mean, everything was locked up. So
yep,
it would that would have been a major, even if they had backup, that would have been a major thing to try to restore it.
yep. Yep. So again, you've got to really look at your environment and what are your constraints. Um, One of the things that I've always thought is a practical way, particularly for small stations to do, is you use your transmitter site as your offsite storage location.
Oh, just back
And
up the stuff. They have the system out there to back up.
backup, that's right. But you also still need, ideally, that offline version, because again, depending upon the type of backup system, the studio gets corrupted. That also means that transmitter site could get corrupted as well.
Well,
So
that's
you
true.
really need to isolate those two and ideally use what generically are called intelligent backup systems, where really you're not sitting there with a backup system online all the time. It's active when it needs to be, and then it's completely offline.
I
Yeah, I
remember it.
saw a case a few years ago where a client had his backups on the network. And of course, they got hit by ransomware, and the first thing that happened was those backups were deleted by the folks accessing, so they
Yep.
had ended up with no backups whatsoever.
Yep.
That will do it. I'll date myself in talking about this, but I remember when we first got into the automation business, we had some sort of a tape backup
Yeah.
that for
Yep.
sales for data for sales. Then it was we had like seven cartridges, and the traffic people would change those out daily, and it would
Yep.
always,
Yep.
you would always have the yesterday's information stored uh, on a hard piece of device that actually sat in a file drawer. So it was free from attack whatsoever. So you could always restore from that.
Yep. I remember back in those days as well. We used a scheme like that where we had seven tape cartridges. You know, Monday Monday through Sunday, and one of the morning master control shift duties was change that tape every morning. And I don't know, I think at 2 o'clock in the morning or something, we ran backups.
So cybersecurity will be with us forever, and those are some good remarks that we talked about today. And it's just something that stations need to take seriously because it's not going away.
Yeah, and I think again, kind of a key takeaway for folks is don't overlook the the simple stuff. Yeah, there's a lot of places you can spend money on cybersecurity, but don't overlook the kind of basic fundamentals. Have that segmented network, have a firewall, change that default login information on all your devices, you know, utilize good password practices and so forth, particularly on those devices that have access from the open internet to them.
Those four steps there will go a long way.
Yep,
And
it's that low hanging fruit.
yeah, uh,
Now that doesn't 100% protect you, but it gets you up in the high 90s,
yeah.
and often that's all you need.
And I be, and John, I'm sure you've seen it too, that most stations, or a lot of the smaller stations, most of those four items you talked about, never, never thought about.
No, that's very true. There's so many times I'll go in and I'll ask what's the access? Oh, it's just admin password, or admin, and it never gets changed until
Right.
something happens and then it's too late. Uh, had one case recently, which was, well, that's probably 3 or 4 years ago, which was really unique. There was a computer service operation in a small community, and they provided IT work for most of the businesses, the town hall, and also the radio station. And they got hacked and got into everybody because there were connections 24/7, 365 to all these different locations that they could assist their clients. And uh, it was not a pretty picture in that particular case. The radio station's insurance company told them they would pay the ransom, and they got their files back and haven't had any problems since. But it's amazing how simplistic access can be to your files if you don't think about it.
And there's a good example of dealing with a reputable hacker. You actually get your files back
Yeah,
after you pay the ransom.
there are not too many of those around.
Well, if you're going to deal with the hackers, you want to be sure it's a reputable one, so you get your money's worth.
Yeah, Wayne, the only problem is I don't think you get to choose the hacker.
They're not listed in the BBB, are they?
Right.
Right. Wayne, in the closing minutes of our program today, something we talked about before we went on the air, I want to just touch on briefly and get your thoughts on it. There's so much of the gear now and the processes used in broadcasting are running something called multicast, where it sends it out and on a multicast IP address, and then the devices that want that can subscribe to that address and it will
Correct.
get it. The people that don't need it don't get it. There are some things to watch out for when you start dealing with multicast in your infrastructure. You might want to talk about that.
Well, certainly, I think to implement multicast in your network, you have to have appropriate equipment, and that is going to be both your routers and particularly your Ethernet switches. Not only they have to be managed switches, but they also have to be capable of handling multicast traffic. And just because you have a managed switch does not mean it is multicast capable. It may be, but it may not be, and it usually depends upon the software load. Uh, and with that, the features that you get, particularly, is a service called IGMP snooping, which allows that Ethernet switch to recognize multicast traffic. Because if a conventional Ethernet switch sees multicast traffic, it's going to treat it as broadcast traffic. And by design, that switch is going to forward those frames to all ports of that switch. And of course, that's defeating the whole purpose of multicast. And basically, you can kind of destroy a network with implementing, let's say, multicast, but not having all your devices in terms of the Ethernet switching devices aware of be multicast capable, multicast aware.
So the switch actually has to be programmed to to act the way multicast is supposed to act, which is, I guess the whole gist behind that is to cut down on traffic on the network,
Yep.
and only devices that want that. You may have a console that needs to get access to in the control room. It may need to get access from the network streams coming in, but the production room doesn't necessarily need that network coming in. So by using multicast, you can say, yeah, if anything shows up in the switch on this address, I'd like to have it. The
Yep.
production room don't care, it don't want it, so it doesn't. And you're, I think the word is subscribe. You subscribe to the multicast particular address, and then if you decide you don't want it, you can unsubscribe, and so it doesn't tie up the network. So people need to be aware of that because there's a lot of that going on in both radio and television. As we mentioned before the show started, there was an article I was reading about devices now that do a form of what we call self-advertising. They announce themselves as when you plug them into the network, may it be a
Hmm.
microphone or a camera or whatever, it will in so many seconds actually advertise itself on the network that I'm here, and if you would like to have it, if you're a director and you need that camera, then yeah, you say yeah, I'd like to have it. The edit suite may not care, so it doesn't ask for it. So there's a lot of that going on now,
All right.
but like you say, you got to your architect of your network has to be set up to make that work. And you
Good.
can get into trouble if you don't. And as we talked about before the show, we ran into that where somebody moved a receiver that was sending out multicasts from one part of a building to another part of a building and plugged it into the network there, and the device that wanted to see that multicast couldn't see it anymore
Yeah.
because it was going through devices that were not set up. When they
All right.
moved it back over and plugged it into the actual switch that the device was on, it was okay.
Yep.
But and I think we talked about this once before that it doesn't necessarily travel through routers very easy either.
Yeah, well, multicast is kind of a it's a it's a weird beast, so to speak. It is a layer three function, so routers is really the key. The router has to be obviously configured, but because the Ethernet switch is sort of that core building block, that switch has to be aware of it. Thus, it has to have multicast features to it. And in most cases, multicast is not going to be automatically enabled. A lot of things in a lot of devices, they're just by default, they're enabled. Multicast, though, is not one of those where you, for instance, specifically have to enable it um, in a given device.
Well, we just about run out of time here, and I've actually lost my PowerPoint for somewhere. I don't know where it went. But anyway, we want to thank you, Wayne, for being with us today. And I hope people got some good information, and I know they did because we covered a lot about cybersecurity, and it's just you just got to pay attention to it and take it seriously.
Yep. Don't overlook those just basic fundamental things.
Okay. All right. With that, we'll end our webinar, and our next webinar will be normally I have it on the slide, but who knows where my PowerPoint just went away. I think a hacker got it. That's what the problem was. Somebody broke in and stole my PowerPoint. So we'll have another one coming up on February the 17th, and our guest at that time will be Chris Alexander with Crossroad Broadcasting, and he's going to talk about directional AM monitor points, which is really one of those subjects that's really interesting. So thank you everybody for joining us. John, good to see you again, and thank you again, Wayne.
Likewise.
All right, Larry, send me $20 and I'll send you that PowerPoint back.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Goodbye, everybody.